Chapter 4 Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi. In ancient times, Shiva himself was present here in his divine form. Later, he took the form of fire, which eventually turned into the Arunachala hill. It is not possible for us to see the divine form of Shiva now in this modern age. It is said that Shiva resides even now in one of the 5 peaks of the hill as Arunagiri Yogi, again in a form that is invisible to the physical eye. As if to provide us all with an opportunity to see the Lord in human form, Arunachala drew the young Venkataraman from Madurai and made him stay at Arunachala. He stayed there as immovable as the hill itself, constantly showering his grace upon innumerable devotees. It was as though Tiruvannamalai, already a sacred spot, had become further sanctified by the presence of Sri Bhagavan. It was through Sri Ramana Maharshi that the fame of Tiruvannamalai and Lord Arunachala spread far beyond the boundaries of India to the remotest corners of the world. Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi was born in a small village called Tiruchuri in South India and had his schooling at Madurai. In his childhood he was called Venkataraman. Even while he was a child, he used to have a constant continuous awareness or spurana of Arunachala. In later times, Bhagavan used to say that in his childhood he believed that this kind of feeling was quite normal and common to all people. It was only much later that he realized that the feeling was not at all a common one. It was this constant spurana resonating within that drew him to Tiruvannamalai and kept him bound to the Arunachala hill for 54 years. Bhagavan, when he was young, somehow had the notion that Arunachala was something extraordinary, not within the reach of the common man. It was only when a relative returning from Tiruvannamalai explained it to him that he realized that Arunachala was another name for the place called Tiruvannamalai. The pull of Arunachala was irresistible, and Bhagavan was drawn to the hill just as inexorably as iron is drawn to a magnet. Bhagavan was extremely simple in his appearance. Even in the coldest day of winter, he wore no more than a loincloth. In the early days of his stay in Tiruvannamalai, he lived for a while in the Arunachaleswara temple. Whether it was within the Padala Linga or under the Ilipai tree, Bhagavan had only a loincloth to protect him from the elements. Even after the ashram was established, Bhagavan never wore anything more. At times his devotees would beg him to use a shawl to cover himself, but he would use it only occasionally to please them. He was indifferent to heat and cold. Even in the hottest hours of the summer days, he would remain barefoot and would walk on the scorching rocks with measured steps in his usual graceful manner. Bhagavan's simplicity was not confined to his appearance. Even his teachings were amazingly simple and direct. Bhagavan was capable of conveying the most profound ideas in an uncomplicated way with a few beautifully chosen words. He taught not through words, but through his glorious life marked by extraordinary detachment and pregnant silence. Once a visitor said to him, "Bhagavan, this is my first visit to the ashram. I have been observing that people keep coming to you and asking questions, and that you clear all their doubts. I am so ignorant that I cannot even think of a question to ask you. How can I ever hope to be liberated?" The man was genuinely anxious, and Bhagavan in his compassion told him, "You say you do not know anything. Who is it that is ignorant? If you can identify that person, you would realize the greatest truth. When one thinks that one knows everything, the ego becomes very strong and obstructs the path of realization. Is it not therefore better to think that one does not know anything?" On another occasion, a lady who was visiting the ashram for the first time said to Bhagavan, "Bhagavan, I have a desire. May I tell you about it?" Bhagavan asked her what she wanted. The lady replied, "Bhagavan, I want realization. That is my only desire. I have no other desires at all. All I want is realization. Can you give me that?" Bhagavan could hardly control his laughter. He said, "Yes, yes, that is very good." The lady was persistent. She said, "Bhagavan, please don't try to put me off with mere words. Please give it to me at once. Will you give it?" Bhagavan merely nodded his head. Finally, the lady took leave of him. As soon as she left, Bhagavan burst into laughter. He said to the devotees around him, "Look at her. She is demanding realization, and that too, immediately. Is it a parcel or a bundle that I can hand over to her as soon as she asks? She says she has no desire. Is this not a desire? When the mind is emptied of all desires, what remains is realization. This cannot be given by anyone. This has to be gained only through sadhana." Another of Bhagavan's devotees wanted to know how a jiva or individual accumulated karma. Bhagavan replied, "First you must find out who this jiva is. After that you can start thinking about how it acquires karma. When you do not even know who or what a jiva is, how can you determine whether it is affected by karma or not? These are unnecessary speculations. You should learn to turn the mind inwards. When this happens, all doubt cease and realization is achieved." In a few words, Bhagavan thus expounded the profound truth. Bhagavan never professed himself to be a Maharishi. Neither did he acknowledge anyone as his disciple. If anyone asked for Upadesa or instruction, he would say, "Who is to instruct whom?" He used to say, "If I am a jnani or a realized soul, there cannot be any ignorant soul outside of me. On the other hand, were I not a realized soul, there is no point in my giving instructions or Upadesa to anyone. Moreover, who is it that wants Upadesa? You must learn to seek him out through self-inquiry. That instruction which helps you in this quest is a real Upadesa." Though Bhagavan declined to function as a conventional guru, his life itself served as a lesson to the sincere seeker. In each act of his life, there is a valuable lesson for us. The method of self-inquiry does not make any distinction of age, sex, caste, or creed. Chapter 5. Who is Ramana? Once, during a conversation with devotees, Bhagavan recounted an interesting incident involving Amartanada Yatindra. This is a story as narrated to us by Bhagavan. Amartanada was an unusual kind of person. He had a lot of interest in all kinds of things. From the early days of my stay in the hill, Amartanada would visit me often. Sometimes he would stay with me for a few days at a stretch. He wrote my biography in Malayalam. Once, Naina asked to have this book read out to him. But after listening to just a few chapters, he cried, "Enough! Enough!" and tore the book to pieces. The trouble with Amartanada was that he liked to exaggerate. It was his practice to attribute all kinds of extraordinary qualities to the subject of his writings. His biography of me was also full of such exaggerated descriptions, and this is probably what annoyed Naina. Once, while I was staying in the Virupaksha cave, Amartanada came to see me. It was during this visit that he composed a poem in Malayalam in which he tried to present me as an avatar or incarnation of the Almighty. The song, when translated, would read, "The ocean of compassion, the great seer, Bhagavan Ramana, who lives in the beautiful cave on the summit of the Arunachala hill. Who is he? Is he Vishnu? Is he the preceptor of Lord Shiva himself, or Lord Subramanya? Is he the great Sivayogi Vararuchi? Or is he the greatest of all seers, the incomparable poet, Vyasa? My heart is full of eagerness to know the identity of my master." Amartanada wrote this poem on a piece of paper and left it under my seat while I had gone out. Leaving the poem there, he left the cave. When I returned to the cave, I found the piece of paper with the poem on it. After reading the poem, I wrote a reply, also in the same meter as Amartanada's own composition. When he came back to the cave, I gave my poem to Amartanada. The poem which I wrote in reply to Amritanatha's queries is as follows. Arunachala Ramana is a supreme being who sports within the lotus hearts of all beings, beginning with Hari in the form of consciousness. If one enters with a heart melting with devotion, the abode in which the Supreme Being is shining, his eye of knowledge will be opened and he will become consciousness itself. The truth will become clear to him. This song was later translated into Tamil also. It was Amarthanatha's desire to attribute some superhuman qualities to me. By asking, is Ramana Hari or Sivaguru or Vararuchi or the poet saint Vyasa, he thought he could trick me into acknowledging one of these identities. But I had written like this, poor man, he couldn't do anything about it. Saying this, Bhagavan smiled mischievously at all of us. Though Bhagavan had disclaimed all superhuman attributes and had stated that he was just that self-knowledge that glows within the heart of every living being, those who had the opportunity to watch Bhagavan interacting with the various creatures around him felt that Amarthanatha had been quite correct in his perception. All the names that Amarthanatha sought to confer upon Bhagavan seem quite appropriate. Bhagavan's compassion was boundless, and it was extended to all creatures. Not only human beings, but animals and birds too were recipients of Bhagavan's grace. In fact, it often appeared as though animals had a greater claim upon Bhagavan's love than mere human beings. Monkeys, squirrels, and even tigers, leopards, and snakes would come to Bhagavan, and he would treat them with incredible affection and compassion. Bhagavan used to say that, depending upon one's karma, even great souls sometimes assumed the most unexpected forms. He forbade his devotees from driving away even the wildest and most ferocious-looking animals. He would say that these animals had as much right to approach him as any human being. On several occasions, Bhagavan has clearly stated that these creatures had come to him, fully aware of his power to set them free from all their bonds. Whether the visitor was a dog or a monkey, a cow or a crow, Bhagavan would never refer to the creature as it. Every one of them was treated with utmost courtesy. If any of the devotees happened to ill-treat an animal or to show anything less than perfect courtesy while dealing with an animal, Bhagavan would be displeased. He would reprimand the erring devotee, saying, "Why do you do that? You do not see anything beyond the outer form. You have no idea about the soul within. What makes you so sure that you are superior to these creatures? They have also come into the world in the same way as we have. Do they not have the same privileges that we human beings claim for ourselves? Why should you try to drive them away?" Bhagavan protected the dumb creatures that came to him and showered his love upon them. From the time when Bhagavan was staying on the hill, monkeys used to visit him regularly. They would approach Bhagavan with utmost confidence. They would bring their disputes to him for judgment. He could understand their language and could communicate with them easily. On several occasions, Bhagavan heard monkeys' complaints about each other and settled their disputes to the satisfaction of all parties involved. The Telugu book Ramana Leela records numerous incidents involving Bhagavan's interactions with monkeys. There was one monkey who enjoyed special privileges. While Bhagavan was staying in the Virupaksha cave, this monkey would saunter in and climb onto Bhagavan's lap. Bhagavan affectionately called him Nondi, the lame one, and would joke with him saying, "Nondi, if you ever become king, please remember all of us." Bhagavan's words came true, and Nondi really became the king of the monkey clan. One day, he brought his queens and his entire retinue and proudly paraded them before Bhagavan. Bhagavan immediately arranged for a grand feast for the entire monkey clan to celebrate Nondi's coronation. Bhagavan's extraordinary involvement with the joys and troubles of his monkey friends cannot fail to remind us of the close ties between Lord Rama and the monkey bands led by Sri Hanuman. Indeed, Amarthanatha was quite right in comparing Bhagavan to Sri Hari. Then of course there is Lakshmi. Lakshmi the cow was the undisputed queen of the cowshed. She was like a beloved daughter to Bhagavan. She was an unusually intelligent animal and seemed to know just how much of a VIP she was. She would walk into the hall unhindered and serenely go up to Bhagavan's sofa with the all-human devotees hurriedly making way for her royal progress. Lakshmi knew the meal times and snack times very well indeed. Bhagavan would feed her bananas with his own hands, and she would relish the delicacy with her eyes closed in ecstasy. Lakshmi had a special liking for a particular type of banana, the deliciously sweet variety known as the hill banana. Whenever someone brought these fruits to the ashram, Bhagavan would say, "This is Lakshmi's favorite. Let us keep it aside for her." Lakshmi enjoyed all sorts of privileges. It would appear that she knew exactly how much of a favorite she was. Sometimes, like a pampered child, she would do something naughty, like trampling the kitchen garden. Naturally, such behavior was not appreciated by the ashram workers, and they would drive the cow away with harsh words and threatening gestures. But Bhagavan would always come to the cow's defense, saying, "It was your fault for not being more careful. You should have erected a fence around the kitchen garden. Why are you scolding poor Lakshmi?" Every Friday, Lakshmi would be dressed up with special care. The attendants would apply turmeric powder on her face and place garlands around her neck and on the tips of her horns. A bright vermilion dot would adorn her forehead. Bedecked like this, Lakshmi would go straight to Bhagavan and stand perfectly still while he caressed her. Sometimes she would lick Bhagavan's hands in a special display of affection. Bhagavan's hands would become red with the repeated licks of her rough tongue, and he would patiently submit to her affectionate caresses without complaining. On Mattu Pongal Day, which is the day after the Sankaranti festival, when Tamilians worship cows, Lakshmi would always receive special attention. On one such day, Bhagavan's devotees requested him to pose for a photograph with Lakshmi. Bhagavan asked for the cow to be brought to the center of the cowshed. A space was cleared and Lakshmi came to stand beside Bhagavan. Tossing her head like a pretty young girl, Bhagavan stood up from his chair and stood near Lakshmi, stroking her neck and shoulder and murmuring soothingly in her ears. At Bhagavan's touch, Lakshmi quietened down and posed like a seasoned model. Supporting himself with the stick in his right hand and with his left arm around Lakshmi's neck, Bhagavan stood there looking like Sri Krishna himself. 3 or 4 photos were taken on this occasion. These also seem to support Amritanada's comparison of Bhagavan with Hari. From the earliest period, that is, from the time when Bhagavan used to live on the hill, peacocks had always been his companions. A few of these peacocks had set up a unique relationship with Bhagavan. Bhagavan himself has recounted the story of one of his peacock companions. He says, "Even after I came to Skandashramam, Palaniswami continued to stay in the Virupaksha cave. He was quite old by the time, and so it was not possible for him to go up and down the hill frequently. He stayed in the Virupaksha cave, and every evening I would visit him there just to make sure that he was quite well. Every time I set out for the Virupaksha cave, a peacock would come all the way with me. He would accompany me to the cave and would wait for me for an hour. At the end of 1 hour, however, he would become quite restless and peck at my feet, take a few steps in the direction of Skandashram, and check to see whether I was following. If I was still in the cave when he looked back, he would return to the cave and peck at my feet again. He would not leave me alone until I started back and would walk beside me all the way back to the Skandashramam. Once Palaniswami was sick and I was reluctant to leave him alone. The peacock was afraid that I might decide to spend the night with Palaniswami. Of course, Palaniswami would have preferred that, but the peacock was determined to take me back to Skandashramam. The peacock refused to leave my side until I was back in Skandashramam. In 1945, the Maharani of Baroda gave Bhagavan a beautiful white peacock. This bird stayed by Bhagavan's side all the time. It enjoyed so much privilege in the ashram that a cage was set up for it just by the side of Bhagavan's sofa. Bhagavan would talk to this peacock just as he talked to human beings. There was one peacock which always waited for Bhagavan's arrival at the entrance to the cowshed, and another one which accompanied him on his walks on the hill. There has always been a large flock of peacocks in the ashram, and visitors to the ashram are first welcomed by a reception committee made up of these brightly colored birds. To see Bhagavan with his shaved head, wearing just a loincloth and surrounded by peacocks was like seeing the Lord of Parani, Sri Subramanya himself. A number of devotees have visualized Bhagavan as Lord Subramanya. So, Amartanada's comparison of Bhagavan with Lord Subramanya is no exaggeration. As for the two other terms used by Amartanada, namely Vararuchi and Yativara, hardly any explanation is required. Bhagavan was a gifted poet. Even Kavya Ganta Ganapati Muni acknowledged that Bhagavan's prowess as a poet was far superior to his own. Bhagavan was able to compose a Telugu poem in a verse form that Kavya Ganta was unable to adopt. Furthermore, Bhagavan explained the intricacies of the grammatical rules governing that kind of verse. Bhagavan has explained obscure rules of grammar to great scholars. Bhagavan's knowledge and versatility as a poet are beyond compare. So, equating Bhagavan to Vararuchi is quite apt and totally natural. The term Yativara means the greatest of seers. Even the heads of mats have acknowledged Bhagavan's unique stature. He was truly the greatest of all seers. Thus, we see that Amartanada has described Bhagavan accurately by comparing him to Hari, Sivaguru, Vararuchi, and Yativara. Chapter 6 Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai. Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai is a work of unparalleled beauty and immeasurable depth of meaning. Sannidhi Murai is a Tamil word meaning listing out one's grievances in the presence of God. In other words, it is a form of poetry in which the devotee prays to the Almighty and begs for his indulgence. The same phrase can also be translated as a set of rules for the conduct of worship in the divine presence. The author of this work is Sri Muruganar, a highly learned Tamil scholar of eminence and a poet. More importantly, Muruganar was an ardent devotee of Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi. His was an absolute and unconditional surrender at the feet of Bhagavan. So much so that he could not even think of any other deity. Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai is in praise of Bhagavan. It captivated the hearts of Bhagavan's devotees to such an extent that they used to memorize long passages from the book and recite them in Bhagavan's presence. In the olden days, Saivite saints used to compose hymns on the presiding deities of every temple they visited. All these hymns were gathered together and compiled into what came to be called the Panniru Tirumurai. Panniru means 12 in Tamil. These hymns are all inspired poetry of the highest order. The sweetness of the language and the beauty of expression are such that these songs have survived all these years, inspiring generation after generation of Lord Siva's devotees. Apart from the Panniru Tirumurai, there are a number of individual Sannidhi Murais sung by various poets through the ages. Even in modern times, the practice of composing Sannidhi Murai continues. The Tirupporur Sannidhi Murai was composed by Sri Chidambara Swami in recent times. When Muruganar composed Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai, he was only continuing a well-established tradition. Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai, however, has some unique characteristics which set it apart from all other Sannidhi Murais. The songs in the Panniru Tirumurai were sung by several different poets at several different temples over a long period of time. The Ramana Sannidhi Murai, except for the 12th chapter, is the work of a single poet with all the poems extolling the praises of a single deity. Moreover, Sri Muruganar has included some songs in verse forms that are not found in the Panniru Tirumurai. The crowning glory of the Ramana Sannidhi Murai is the chapter describing the extraordinary power of Bhagavan's glance of grace. Kannokam. Bhagavan had the power to transport a devotee to a higher plane through a mere glance of his eyes. Sri Muruganar tells us that a single glance from Bhagavan's eyes can grant liberation to a devotee and free him from the cycle of birth and death. The story of how the Ramana Sannidhi Murai came to be written is very interesting. Even before his first visit to Tiruvannamalai, Sri Muruganar had developed a very high regard for Bhagavan, hearing about him from his devotees and from reading Bhagavan's works. Every time he read the Tiruvachakam, a devotional song composed by the poet saint Manikavachakar, Muruganar would be filled with a longing that just as Manikavachakar had found a suitable guru, he too should have the good fortune to find a guru soon. It was in this state of mind that Muruganar came to Tiruvannamalai. On reaching Tiruvannamalai, Muruganar went to the Arunachaleswara temple to thank God for making his trip to Tiruvannamalai possible. While in the temple, he felt that he should take some suitable offering for Bhagavan. So he sat down in the temple hall and composed a decade of verses and took it with him to Ramanashram. These are the 10 verses known as the Desika Padikam. In Tamil and Sanskrit, the word Desika means Guru. Upon entering the ashram, Muruganar was assailed by doubts. He felt that he was ignorant about the etiquette to be followed when meeting a great sage. As Muruganar stood hesitating at the entrance to the hall, Bhagavan himself came out of the hall and came towards the spot where Muruganar was standing. It was as if the Guru had come to welcome his disciple. The sight of Bhagavan took Muruganar's breath away. For a few minutes he just stood there, drinking in Bhagavan's form with his eyes. Suddenly, he remembered the verses he had written. He took out the piece of paper and tried to read from it. But his eyes were flooded with tears and his voice was choked with emotion. He was incapable of reading anything. In the end, Bhagavan himself had to take the paper from Muruganar's hands and read the verses himself. So great was Bhagavan's compassion for his devotee that he took the trouble to read all the 10 verses standing at the entrance of the hall, while the author of those verses just stood and gazed at him. Afterwards, Muruganar would write poems once in a while and lay them at Bhagavan's feet. Upon reading one of these poems, Bhagavan significantly remarked with grace, "These lines are just like the verses in Manikavachakar's Tiruvachakam. Why don't you write some more verses like these? If you continue to compose verses in the same way, you can write another Tiruvachakam." Hearing these words, Muruganar was overcome by emotion. He was so moved by Bhagavan's confidence in him that he broke down. Through his sobs, he stammered, "Bhagavan, in your compassion, you have compared me to the great poet saint. It is true that you are the Lord Shiva himself, but I am a worthless creature. I am not worthy of being compared to Manikavachakar. Where is the shining star and where is the firefly? I am not capable of emulating Manikavachakar, on whom divine grace had descended in abundance." Bhagavan listened to Muruganar but did not answer in words. His only response was a long, deep look into Muruganar's eyes. This one glance was powerful enough to inspire in him the confidence to start writing poetry of rare beauty. He started composing verses regularly. Coming to know of this, a devotee, N.R. Krishnamurti Iyer, said to him, "These poems are quite good, and it would be a good idea to systematically compile them into a Sannidhi Murai." Thus the Ramana Sannidhi Murai started taking shape. Muruganar firmly believed that Bhagavan made use of him as an instrument for the creation of this work. Several stanzas in Ramana Sannidhi Murai bring out this idea. Bhagavan's glance of grace had the power to uplift a person and impart spiritual knowledge. Through more than 30 verses titled Ch.9 or Divine Glance, Muruganar describes the power of Bhagavan's glance of grace and ends each verse with a plea for the bestowal of this glance on the devotees. Chapter 7, Composition of Ramana Puranam. Ramana Sannidhi Murai of Muruganar has been modelled on the Tiruvachakam of Manikavachakar. The very first chapter in Tiruvachakam is a beautiful one titled Siva Puranam. But the first edition of the Ramana Sannidhi Murai did not contain an equivalent chapter. Muruganar wanted to correct this inadequacy, and so he started composing the same chapter. He had written some lines when he was suddenly assailed by doubts regarding the appropriate title for this particular chapter. As Muruganar had followed the model of Tiruvachakam, he should have given the same title for this chapter also. But he wanted to name it Ramana Puranam instead of Siva Puranam, to signify that these songs were in praise of the living God, Sri Ramana. He also felt obliged to follow the original in every detail. Unable to come to a decision, Muruganar gathered up the papers of this unfinished chapter and laid the bundle at Bhagavan's feet. He did not say anything to Bhagavan about the confusion in his mind and left the hall. It was evening by the time he returned to the hall again. As soon as Muruganar entered the hall, Bhagavan beckoned him close, gave him back the bundle of papers and said, "Have a look at the papers." Immediately, Muruganar opened the bundle and started reading. One glance was enough. Muruganar was speechless with surprise. He had not mentioned his confusion to Bhagavan, neither had he asked for Bhagavan's advice. But the master had answered the disciple's unspoken question in the most unmistakable manner. At the top of the page was the title Ramana Puranam. Not only that, Bhagavan had written Ramana Puranam on top of every single page, and moreover, he had added many more lines of poetry to Muruganar's own composition. When the second edition of Ramana Sannidhi Murai was prepared for publication, Muruganar added the Ramana Puranam. While checking the proofs, Muruganar made a mark in the text and added a footnote saying that only a portion of this chapter had been his own work and that the rest of the lines beyond the mark had been composed by Sri Bhagavan himself. After correcting the proofs, Muruganar handed over the copy to Bhagavan and requested him to check it. Bhagavan noticed the mark Muruganar had made and read the footnote. At once, he turned to Muruganar and said, "So, only this portion is Bhagavan's, is it?" These words had shattering effect on Muruganar. He fell at Bhagavan's feet and sobbed, "Bhagavan, what a grave mistake I have made. Please forgive me. I have not done anything at all. It is all your work. Every single line of poetry owes its existence to your infinite grace." The mark and the footnote were removed immediately. This incident is sufficient proof that the Ramana Sannidhi Murai was composed only by the grace of Bhagavan Sri Ramana. Upadesa Undiyar adorns the central portion of Ramana Sannidhi Murai. The Bhagavad Gita, which is the essence of Sri Krishna's teachings, is at the heart of the Mahabharata. Similarly, the Upadesa Undiyar, which was later translated into Sanskrit, Telugu and Malayalam by Bhagavan as Upadesa Saram, the essence of Bhagavan's teachings, forms the central portion of Ramana Sannidhi Murai. In this beautiful song, Bhagavan has condensed the lessons taught by all the Upanishads and set them down in one comprehensive poem. Incidentally, Upadesa Undiyar is the only work composed in the form of a book by Bhagavan. Ramana Sannidhi Murai has yet another distinction. Bhagavan has stated that it is equal to Tiruvachakam in all respects. Bhagavan has given his endorsement in the form of a poem. Vishwanatha Swami, one of Bhagavan's disciples, was also an intimate friend of Muruganar. Muruganar had a passionate love for the Tamil language. This made him change his original name of Ramanathapuram Subramaniam to Mugavapuri Murugan. Mugavapuri is the Tamil name for his birthplace, Ramanathapuram, and Murugan is the Tamil equivalent of his name, Subramaniam. Vishwanatha Swami was amused by Muruganar's fastidiousness and liked to tease him. Once, while he was in the hall with Bhagavan and a few other devotees, Vishwanatha Swami kept repeating the phrase, Mugavapuri Murugan. Bhagavan noticed this and said to him, "Vishwanatha, Instead of simply chanting it, why don't you compose a poem using those two words? Viswanatha Swami immediately took out a piece of paper and very enthusiastically began his poem with the words Mugavapuri Murugan. Try as he might, however, he could not think of anything beyond these two words. At last, in sheer frustration, he went out, leaving the paper with Bhagavan. By the time Viswanatha Swami returned, Bhagavan had a lovely poem ready. Apart from the two words Mugavapuri Murugan, nothing had been written by Viswanatha Swami. Nevertheless, Bhagavan had signed the poem Viswanathan, thus attributing its composition to Viswanatha Swami. A translation of the poem follows. Arunachala Ramana, the one who resides in the lotus of my heart, laughed at my foolish ego and destroyed it completely with a single glance. He then proceeded to shower his grace upon me, Mugavapuri Murugan, to enable me to enlighten the entire world with the Murai, Ramana Sannidhi Murai, which is comparable to the Tiruvachakam. Muruganar has composed more than 30,000 poems in sweet, pure Tamil, and most of these works like Guru Vachaka Kovai, Ramana Anubhuti, and Sri Ramananyana Bodham in 9 volumes have already appeared in book form. Chapter 8. Ramakrishna Iyer. My uncle Ramakrishna Iyer was one of the earliest devotees to come to Bhagavan. He had surrendered himself to Bhagavan while the master was staying in the Virupaksha cave. Ramakrishna Iyer's younger brother, Ranganatha Iyer, is my father. Our ancestral village is Padi Agraharam in Chengam Taluk. This village is about 20 miles to the west of Tiruvannamalai. This is where my uncle and my father were born. In their adult years, both the brothers settled down in Tiruvannamalai. My uncle was the Munsif of Tiruvannamalai town. This being an influential position, my uncle's family was comfortably placed in life. My father was a contractor. His work took him to the Kurnool district of Andhra Pradesh, and he eventually settled down there. But even after establishing his business in Andhra Pradesh, my father could never stay away from Tiruvannamalai for long. He often visited his brother and would go with him to Ramanashram. It is only because of my elder's devotion to Bhagavan that I came into his fold eventually. In addition to his work in Tiruvannamalai, my uncle also had the job of contractor in the salt pans of Pondicherry. He was a man of very generous nature. He made liberal donations to Ramanashram and assisted the ashram authorities in all their activities. Chinnaswamy had a special regard for my uncle. Whenever important visitors came to the ashram, my uncle would be informed immediately. My uncle's wife, Ponnammal, was an extraordinary lady. She had no worldly attachments at all. She had received initiation from Kavyaganta Ganapati Muni and was constantly engaged in prayers and puja. She paid little attention to household affairs. Nevertheless, the household functioned quite smoothly and there was no dearth of visitors to the house. My aunt was a beautiful lady with a radiant face. She never plaited her hair but let it hang loose all the time. She worshipped goddess Shakti. She used to say that because of her intense devotion to the goddess, she experienced something like an electric shock if ever her bare feet touched the ground. So she always wore a pair of wooden sandals on her feet. She never wore any jewels on her person. If relatives or guests arrived unexpectedly, my aunt would immediately pick up her slippers and go into her room. She neither welcomed visitors nor objected to their visits. She simply did not get involved in taking care of guests. But my uncle never complained about this. Instead, he took care of the details himself. There was a young Brahmin boy to take care of the cooking, and my uncle managed all the other household affairs. In any situation, the ashram authorities could depend upon my uncle for prompt and generous assistance. Once, Chinnaswamy sent word that the priest who usually performed the puja at the ashram temple had not come that day. Immediately, my uncle sent his cook to the ashram so that the puja could be performed on time. In the early days, the ashram had to deal with a number of problems. Every time trouble arose, my uncle used to take charge of the situation and try to find a suitable solution for the problem. When thieves broke into the ashram, it was my uncle whom Kunjaswami fetched from the town. My uncle could always be depended upon to assist the ashram authorities in every possible manner. Whenever the need arose, Chinnaswami would send word to him, and my uncle never let him down. My aunt had a great regard for Kaviganta Ganapati Muni, Naina. Very often, Naina would come to stay in my uncle's house with a group of his disciples. All their needs were well taken care of. Even after Naina set up his own house in Tiruvannamalai, my aunt used to send provisions and other essentials to his house through the servants. My uncle never objected to this practice. In the same way, my aunt did not object to the streams of visitors who arrived at the house, especially during the Deepam and other temple festivals. All the guests were assured of a very comfortable stay, and my aunt never interfered with my uncle's arrangements for their welfare. My uncle and aunt had an excellent understanding and a high regard for each other. Neither of them ever criticized or even questioned the activities of the other. They were an unusual couple. Though they lived within the framework of family life, they had no worldly attachments. This unique couple had only one son named Radhakrishnan, and everybody called him Radha. He had acquired his parents' unique qualities. Worldly pursuits held no attraction for him. He was devoted to Bhagavan and spent all his spare time in Ramanashram. Bhagavan had a special regard for this young man. Radha spent all his college vacations in the ashram. He would often go around the hill with Bhagavan. He spent all his time in spiritual pursuits under the guidance of Bhagavan. Neither Radha nor his mother showed any interest or involvement in the affairs of the relatives. My uncle alone attended weddings and other family functions. The poorer relatives could always count upon my uncle for generous monetary help in all situations. Radha finished his studies and found employment as an engineer in the railways. He requested his parents to come and live with him, but my uncle refused to leave Tiruvannamalai and Bhagavan. In the end, Radha was forced to leave my uncle to manage on his own. He took his mother with him and looked after her with great affection and dedication. After a while, my uncle started having some difficulty in living alone. He stayed with us in Madras for some time. He also stayed at Ramanashram for a while. Occasionally, he would go to stay with his son for a few days. In his last days, my uncle was in Ramanashram, where Chinnaswami took very good care of him. But in spite of the best treatment, my uncle's health declined rapidly. Finally, the ashram authorities sent word to Radha. He came immediately and took his father to his house and did his best to restore his father's failing health. But all of Radha's efforts were in vain. In 1934, my uncle Ramakrishna Iyer breathed his last. Chapter 9. Do not touch those seeds. From a very young age, my uncle's son Radha showed interest in spiritual matters. In his childhood, Radha used to accompany his father to Ramanashram almost every day. He developed a great love for Bhagavan, and Bhagavan was especially gracious to the little boy. During the Skandashramam period, Radha would rush up the hill every evening after school. He brought a flask of coffee with him and would invariably reach the Skandashramam by 5 o'clock. He would return home only after dark. He used to converse freely with Bhagavan and would insist upon staying close to Bhagavan all the time. After he finished school, Radha went to Madras and joined the Christian college. During those years, he kept up a regular correspondence with Bhagavan. All his holidays were spent at Ramanashram with Bhagavan. Just before leaving Madras, Radha would write to Bhagavan and tell him that he would be arriving at the ashram soon and express his desire to go around the hill with him. Once, when Appu Sastri, a devotee, asked Bhagavan whether they could go for Giri Pradakshinam, Bhagavan replied, "Radha has written to say that he will be arriving here tomorrow. He will certainly insist upon going around the hill with me. Let us wait for him and do the Giri Pradakshinam tomorrow." On these long walks around the Arunachala hill, Bhagavan would support himself with an arm around Radha's shoulders. Once, just before setting out on Giri Pradakshina, the devotees thought up a plan of taking up one subject each for discussion in turn. According to the rules of the game, each person had to give a short speech on some topic of their choice. Everybody made an effort, but Radha kept quiet. Kunjaswami noticed this and said, "Come on, Radha, it is your turn now. What are you going to talk about?" In reply, Radha said, "Do Jivan Muktas or liberated souls have to speak? Do they ever make speeches?" On hearing this, Bhagavan smiled and said, "Oh, don't Jivan Muktas speak then?" All the others were amazed by Radha's rather unusual response, but Bhagavan seemed to be very pleased. Something very interesting happened on another occasion. Radha had come to the ashram. Bhagavan was just leaving for Palakuttu. As Bhagavan always walked barefoot and as the stones on the path were often burning hot, the devotees had decided to plant some shade-giving trees along the path. They had dug a row of pits along the path and had some seeds ready for planting. They wanted Bhagavan to plant the seeds with his hands, and so they were waiting for him to come there. They had the seeds on a tray. When Bhagavan came to the spot, he saw the pits and the group of devotees gathered there. He asked, "What is going on?" The devotees explained their plans and requested Bhagavan to plant the seeds with his own hands. Just as Bhagavan reached out to pick up a seed from the tray, there was a loud shout from Radha. Everybody was startled to see Radha running towards them, shouting, "Bhagavan, Bhagavan, please don't touch those seeds." Bhagavan exclaimed, "What is this? All of you told me to sow these seeds. Now Radha is telling me not to touch them. What am I to do?" Everyone turned to Radha, waiting for an explanation for his behavior. By this time, Radha was in tears. In between sobs, he stammered, "Bhagavan, do you know what these people are planning to do? They want to grow shade-giving trees along the path. But if you touch those seeds, the whole purpose of the exercise would be defeated. One look from your eyes is enough to set a man free from the cycle of birth and death. When this is so, what will happen to those seeds if your hands touch them? Will they not attain liberation immediately? How then can they grow into trees?" Everyone was stunned by Radha's explanation for his strange behavior. Bhagavan gave him a keen look, but did not say anything. Actually, Radha's fears were well-founded. Just a few months previous to this incident, Radha, Kunjaswami and Bhagavan had planted some onion seeds in the kitchen garden. As they were planting the seeds, they were jocularly remarking among themselves that they would watch out as to whose seeds would grow into the sturdiest plants. A few days later, Kunjaswami's and Radha's seeds had become healthy little plants, but none of the seeds planted by Bhagavan had germinated. Radha told the devotees about this incident and explained the reason for his apparently strange behavior. The devotees were thrilled and moved when they heard this story from Radha. Bhagavan too appeared to be pleased by Radha's perceptive observations. All through his life, he lived like an ascetic, attending to his duties without any attachment or emotional involvement. He lived according to Bhagavan's precepts, constantly practicing self-inquiry and meditating upon Bhagavan's teachings. In 1950, the same year as Bhagavan's nirvana, Radha shed his mortal body and attained the lotus feet of his master. Chapter 10. My longing to stay at Sri Ramanashram. Every time my parents took me to my uncle's house, my uncle Ramakrishna Iyer would arrange for us all to visit Ramanashram to see Bhagavan. On one occasion, my uncle had some work to do and could not take me to the ashram himself. So he sent me with one of our relatives. I was around 8 years old at the time. Somehow, this particular visit has stayed fresh in my memory all these years. When we reached the ashram, we found Bhagavan sitting on a small platform at the entrance to a thatched shed. I prostrated myself before Bhagavan and then stood watching him silently. Bhagavan inquired something of my companion and he replied to him. I do not remember the conversation now, but I remember the beatific smile Bhagavan gave me. The memory of that smile has stayed with me ever afterwards. On every subsequent visit to the ashram, I would think of that enchanting smile. While I was in the 5th standard, I had a lesson on Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. That lesson made a profound impression on my mind. I felt inspired by Sri Ramakrishna's story, and it awakened in me a desire for a life free from all worldly attachments. I wanted to dedicate myself to spiritual pursuits, and it grew stronger with the passage of time. As if to strengthen my resolve, a couple of incidents occurred soon afterwards. The first incident was the death of a neighbor. When I saw his wife's grief, I thought, she is in this situation only because she got married. Marriage must, therefore, be considered a main cause of her misery. The same evening, there was some festival in the temple, and the deity was taken out in a grand procession as part of the ongoing festival. As the procession passed in front of our house, I saw a Devadasi dancing at the head of the procession. The two images, one of the grieving widow I had seen in the morning, and the other of the dancing girl, flashed into my mind one after the other. I felt convinced that marriage had caused the first woman's misery, and that the second woman was able to lead a life of freedom only because she was not married. Then and there I resolved not to get married. However, God had willed otherwise. When I was 12 years old, my parents started making arrangements for my marriage. I tried my best to convince my father that marriage was not for me. I begged and pleaded, but my efforts were all in vain. The elders in the family forced my father to finalize my marriage immediately, in spite of my vehement protest. I felt very badly frustrated and totally helpless. Then one day, I went to my father and expressed my feelings to him in clear terms. I said, in spite of my repeated protests, you have finalized my marriage. I might be young, but my determination is very strong. I am absolutely certain that I cannot lead the life of a married woman. By ignoring my protests and going ahead with your plans for my marriage, you are making a mistake which you will definitely regret later. If later on you happen to find yourself in an embarrassing situation, please do not blame me. Now when I think about it, I am amazed at my own boldness. I had never spoken to my father like that before. I think some power beyond my comprehension must have activated me and given me the courage to talk to my father so boldly at the age of 12. My father had a lot of affection for me, and he also had a genuine concern for my feelings. But he was quite helpless. It must have been extremely difficult for him to take a decision. I appreciate that now. At the time, my father said, "Kanaka, all the arrangements for your marriage have already been finalized, so please cooperate with us now. Later on, if you continue to feel as you do now, I will try to comply with your wishes. I will not try to force you into anything against your wish. But please do not stop the marriage now at this stage." I felt that if this was to be my destiny, I just had to go along. So I went through the ceremony of marriage without any further protest. When the time came for me to start family life, however, I brought my resolve into action. Nothing could shake my resolve. The entire household was plunged into gloom. My mother was heartbroken. My father was bound by his promise to me and did not try to force me to do anything against my wish. I remained oblivious to all the conflicting emotions of my family members. I calmly continued with my normal routine. I would get up at 3 o'clock every morning. After having my bath, I would sit in meditation under a tree in our garden. After a few hours of quiet meditation, I would engage myself in the performance of puja, recitation of prayers, and reading from the scriptures. Each time I went to Ramanashram and saw Bhagavan, my heart would melt and tears would pour down my face. There was a great longing in my heart, a longing to settle down at Ramanashram. On one of my visits to the ashram, Bhagavan looked at me and asked, "Where is Radha now?" Bhagavan was referring to my cousin Radhakrishnan. Bhagavan's very first words to me were about Radha. To Bhagavan's question, I replied, "He is now in Guntakal." Bhagavan said, "Oh, so he has left Gudur and gone to Guntakal, has he?" and smiled at me. In 1944, I visited the ashram. When I entered the hall and saw the devotees sitting in meditation in his presence, my heart cried silently, "Bhagavan, I long to stay in your presence, just like all these fortunate people. Will my prayers ever be answered? How much longer should I waste my time in journeying to and fro?" The thought brought tears to my eyes. With brimming eyes, I prostrated and stood up. Bhagavan gave me a long look of compassion, which moved me. But I was unable to express my anguish in words. I usually remained silent in his presence. Somehow, I could never talk to him openly, even to tell him about the great longing in my heart. His mere darshan used to make me inactive. Many times I had seen devotees approaching Bhagavan with some query or the other, and I had heard Bhagavan clearing their doubts. At times I would think, I must also ask him something. But immediately a voice within me would say, "Do you really need to tell Bhagavan what is in your heart? Is he not capable of reading your thoughts?" With this thought, the desire to ask questions would disappear from my mind. As soon as the desire died out, my mind would become light and free. I could feel a great peace settling on me. All desires for speech and action would disappear, and my mind would lay itself down at Bhagavan's feet, completely calm and content. I cannot explain this strange phenomenon. It was not that I feared that Bhagavan might not reply if I asked him something. He was ever gracious to all his devotees, regardless of their individual merits or level of scholarship. I am not capable of describing my own state of mind. Anyway, this feeling did not really bother me much. It did not seem particularly important to me. I just accepted the state of affairs and never wasted my time trying to find an explanation for it. My restlessness affected my parents deeply, but their concern for me made it difficult for them to agree to my settling down at Ramanashram. It took me quite some time to persuade my parents. A few days before I finally came to Arunachala, I had a strange and wonderful experience. It was very early in the morning and I was still asleep. It was my normal practice to get up at 4 in the morning and to spend the quiet early morning hours in meditation. On this particular morning, I had not risen from bed and I felt Bhagavan's presence close to me. I felt that he was sitting beside me, caressing me from the neck to the heart. He smiled at me and said, "What is it that you gave me? Why is it that I love you so much?" As he spoke, he continued to stroke my neck and throat with an infinitely tender touch. I cannot say how long this experience lasted. I'm sure it was not just a dream. All my senses were aware of Bhagavan's presence by my side. With his words and his touch, Bhagavan brought a sense of peace and contentment to my restless heart. I have no idea of how long I lay like that. When my sister-in-law noticed that I had not risen at my usual time, she came and woke me up. Even after getting up, I continued to be aware of some unusual feeling deep in my heart. A deep peace had taken possession of my senses. Though I carried on with my routine activities, I was in a dazed state. My parents noticed the change in me. They were finally convinced that family life was not for me. They had no choice but to let me have my way. So in 1946, I came to Tiruvannamalai with my parents' permission to stay there permanently. My spiritual journey had begun at last.